The topic that we are going to be discussing is the emerging trends in alopecia management. Now, this is a very broad term, and I would restrict the discussion to pattern hair loss and not go in any other type of alopecias. I have no conflicts of interest to declare. I would like to ask all the panelists, in this situation of the pandemic that we are all, facing, are you practicing regularly? Are you performing any procedures in your clinic? And how are you ensuring yours and the patient's safety? Let's start with Dr. Puneet.
Good morning, everyone. I am practicing regularly. And obviously, the new norm is taking care. We are practicing social distancing. We're also doing procedures like peels, lasers, and PRP. And we are ensuring the regular safety measures like disinfection and using a PPE kit. And whenever possible, ensuring that the patient is wearing his mask. Because a lot of dermatology procedures, you will actually have to ask the patient to remove the mask. That's where the risk increases. But like, say, for example, hair treatments, everything can be done with the mask on. So I feel more safer doing a hair procedure in this time than doing something for the face.
Dr. Sujit?
Yes, sir. So my practice is going on regularly, but I've decreased the working hours because with the mask sitting for hours on end does tend to get a bit more tiring. So the OPD is running regularly, but you have decreased the working hours slightly. Apart from that, procedures are going on. And like Dr. Puneet was mentioning, in certain cases where we have to do the procedure without the mask, so we prefer to keep those procedures at the end of the day. And apart from that, we do try to follow all the precautions, keep distance, sanitize regularly. So we try to do our best.
Are you performing hair transplants?
Yes, sir.
And what precautions do you take while performing a hair transplant? Like, basically, you'll have to evaluate the patient from a COVID perspective. And in the procedure room, do you have any special measures for this?
So we do wear the PPE kit when we're doing hair transplant. Apart from that, we ask the patient clinically whether he has any symptoms. Now, he can be a symptomatic carrier, but even if it's in the latent phase, the test may not come out positive. So we don't do the COVID test before the transplant surgery, but we make sure that there is no history or any symptoms and there's no history of exposure. And we do the regular pre-HT workup, and with the PPE kit, we go ahead with the procedure.
So you treat it as positive when you work with a patient
Yes, sir.
like this?
Every case, even the OPD cases. Yeah.
Okay. So if you have to work with a PPE, how do you use magnification like loops? And
so I
can
keep
you
it so
really...
in the face shield, under the face shield is where I put on the loop first, and then I carry on with that. So usually we used to take a break, maybe for do extraction for a while and take a break. So we have avoid doing that, and we do it at a stretch.
Do you think there could be any medical legal implications for not doing the COVID test prior to the surgery, especially when the prevalence locally is very high? Because your consent will have to incorporate the COVID situation, and I don't think.
So for every patient,
pardon me.
So for every patient who comes to our clinic, not just for hair transplant, so we do have a consent form signed by the patient that in times of COVID, he will not be holding the clinic responsible in case if he catches the infection. So even if it's an OPD patient or a procedure patient, we take the consent from each and every patient coming to our clinic.
Okay. Dr. Gitanjali? Is Dr. Gitanjali
My
there?
practice, of course, does not involve a lot of... Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, sir. So I'm very much following things like Dr. Puneet. Of course, I'm not into surgery. But yes, sir, every patient is a COVID positive. That's the care we take, due diligence, spacing out patients, spacing out procedures, isolations, social distancing, temperature monitoring, sanitization as far as possible, sir.
Especially if you're doing, like you are a cosmetologist and you'll have to do a lot of procedures on the face.
Yes,
and that time the patient is unmasked.
Yes,
so what do you do for that part?
So I just try being alone in the room with one, and both of us are completely, sir, worn the PPE precautionary kit when we are trying to inject on the face, sir.
Okay. I think one thing that can be incorporated here is nasal spray and oral rinses with povidone iodine. And they have shown that it almost reduces the viral load by 90%. And I think that could be a policy that is followed in the OPD as well. When patients coming in, before they see you, they have to rinse their mouth and come in. So whatever load is there can be minimized to some extent. That is what I have been following. I have not had any surgery done. I've stopped operating since March. Primarily one, because I'm not sure about the whole process being effectively performed by me, since I perform the entire process myself. So working in a PPE for 8 hours is a big issue. Secondly, I am having a problem using the magnifying loops with the PPE kit. So I don't want to compromise the outcome by performing the surgery. So this is one of the reasons that I have not actually gone ahead to perform the surgery. I would also like to ask the audience.
Okay, so I'll be launching a poll now.
Yeah.
So audience will get 20 seconds to complete the poll.
Okay.
And we'll be having the results at the end of the day. All right, so we are ending the polling. So I'm sure, can you see the results?
Yeah, I can see that. It's 22% are regularly continuing their OPD practice and 22% are irregular. It's almost, and rest of the 50% are below 50% of the normal. Okay. Fine, we'll go on to the next part of the discussion now. What are the normal, I would like to ask this as a general question. What would be the commonest kind of hair problem that you would see in your practice in the OPD? Means as dermatologists, you must be getting a huge number of hair patients and scalp patients. So they all get clubbed under one heading as a hair patient. So what would be your kind of patient flow that you would have amongst this? What would be the majority? Let's start with Puneet.
So, maximum cases are scalp issues like dandruff, seborrheic dermatitis, or scalp psoriasis. That would be the maximum. Then second would be telogen effluent in terms of number, if I have to say. And the third would be patterned hair loss. And one trend that I'm seeing, like in the last 5 years, is that earlier we used to see cases grade 4, 5, 6, which were already advanced cases of androgenic alopecia. But now the whole newer millennials and baby boomers are so aware of hair thinning that I've started getting children at 15, 16, 18 with the earliest of possible signs of hair thinning, which I can probably pick up only in a dermoscopy examination. So we are picking up early, and a lot of people feel that they have androgenic alopecia, whereas it's only time that will tell that whether they progress to that state. So that's one change.
Okay. And do the panelists agree? Other panelists agree with this, or do you have something else that you all face in the OPD?
Sir, I think
Totally.
Pattern hair loss as the first one in my OPD. As Puneet just said, the level of consciousness has gone very high. I think I'll put my dermatological disorders under second. Of course, COVID brings in a lot of telogen effluent these days. I think they're all homebound, and a lot of low vitamin D3 and ferritin is what I've been seeing. So, but otherwise, I think I go with the pattern hair loss in my OPD.
Okay. Dr. Sujit?
Absolutely, sir. So I agree with ma'am. So initially, like last year, on an average, I would say that pattern hair loss was more common. But in the past 3 months, I have seen that the telogen effluvium cases are much more common compared to the pattern hair loss. Now, pattern hair loss maybe it's not an emergency, so patients are not that bothered or they're delaying it currently. But telogen effluvium cases are much more commonly seen by me in the past couple of months.
Okay, now I'm taking a detour from what I've said. Since it's a very interesting and it's a relevant discussion, I would like to ask you, do you know what would be the reason for having more patients of effluvium reporting to a dermatologist or to a doctor in this time of the pandemic? Can you just, what is your understanding of why this is happening? Yeah, Sujit, you can talk.
Yes, sir. So now telogen effluvium is basically a stress-induced hair fall. So in the COVID times, mental stressor has been commonly more severe. Then also there is nutritional deficiency, diet irregularity, sleep irregularity. So all these factors do play a role. And like Dr. Gitanjali Shetty was mentioning, even vitamin D deficiency, now that does tend to be common, but the prolonged and predominant indoor time that is being spent, that further adds to it to some extent. So that is why, in my opinion, telogen cases are much more commonly seen. Also, the other thing I do tell the patients, previously, like normally on their normal routine, they travel to work, they travel around, so they don't notice the hair falling everywhere. But now they're at home the entire time. So at the end of the day, next day, when they clean their room, they see the hair bunched together. So that also gives a pseudo perception that the hair fall is probably more.
That is a very valid point. And another thing that you should know, that stress comes from being confined to a small space. The original studies which looked at stress-induced hair changes in the mice were conducted by tying one leg of the mice to the cage, not allowing the movement. See, you can imagine the scenario. If you are not allowed to go out of the four walls of your house, it is going to, irrespective of anything. Now people are juggling, managing their homes with the domesticated work that they have to do, plus their office work. And that stress is an equally important factor. So all these lead to this, and basically the flight or fight mechanism that our body has, the moment it perceives stress in any form, it initiates this entire cascade of release of factors which lead to a change in the anagen-telogen ratio, which then reflects in your hair fall. So reassurance is one thing, and obviously you need to look for the nutritional deficiencies. Okay, now when we come to pattern hair loss, there are a lot of things that I have, as a doctor, looked at how I, tend to either define the problem, whether it is androgenetic or should be called pattern hair loss, what is the pathogenesis, what are the factors that are responsible for it, how do you diagnose? See, there has to be some clear-cut diagnostic criteria that when a patient has come to me, why do I label him pattern hair loss and not telogen effluvium and not alopecia areata? I have to have clear diagnostic criteria, which will then help me take a call on the treatment of what I'm going to prescribe to the patient. So treatments are large, a lot of them, and there is just no end to the amount of treatments available for hair loss management. So let us go to the definition. How would you define hair loss, pattern hair loss, Dr. Gitanjali?
So I would define it as primarily the hair that kind of falls or presents in a particular pattern, usually on the top or the front of the scalp. Of course, in male pattern, it's like a receding hairline, but there's a loss of hair on both the crown's vertex, or maybe the combination of both. And in female, probably a widening of the midline partition, which classically presents as thinning of the hair.
Anybody would like to add to that?
These are diffused hair loss pattern. Sir, and I would kind of do it again with the trichoscopy, with so the trichoscopic findings of both of them with variable of thicknesses, the hair villus and the thickness of the hair ratio differences, or trichomonasis, and all those findings, sir.
I basically would like to define it. See, I have not come across a proper definition in any of the textbooks.
Yes.
I would look at it as a pattern, progressive and potentially reversible miniaturization limited to frontal and central areas in genetically predisposed individuals. Now, all these factors may not be present in a given patient, but still he may be a case of pattern hair loss. But what is important, that there is involvement of varying degrees from frontal, mid-scalp and crown areas, but most important is consistent sparing of the occipital and occipitoparietal fringe. Now, this is crucial to our diagnosis, because that is where our treatment is going to be decided upon. So do you agree with this definition? Yeah, Sushil.
Yes, so apart from the classical pattern seen in females, the crown thinning, as per the Lodyga-Sinclair classification pattern, there is also Hamilton pattern where the temporal thinning is seen in females, which also is one of the presenting signs that concerns the females.
Yeah. So basically what we know of the situation is that there is increased androgen receptor expression in these areas. There is increased expression of the 5-alpha reductase type 2, and there is decreased expression of the aromatase enzyme. Now, this is what is known to us through various publications. We do not know the genetic implications in women, though they have found multiple genes involved, but they have not been able to pinpoint as to what exact loci we are talking about. In men, there have been a few genes that have been found to be implicated, but there are, in the last study that was presented, there's more than 270 genetic components which can express the problem of pattern hair loss in men. So we really don't know what are the genetic implications today. And if I were to look at the way androgens would act, now this is a pathway that I feel, if I look at the flowchart, it is a way I can explain in a lot of patients that this is how things must be working out. But this doesn't work in every patient in the same manner, because you will see that some patients whom you have put on finasteride, who are classical male pattern hair loss, but do not respond to finasteride, do not respond to dutasteride, but their hair loss is very much a pattern base. And in women, obviously there may be no signs of hyperandrogenism or no symptoms of hyperandrogenism, and where females are concerned, the genetic history again will not be very clear. So what are the other factors that you feel could be implicated in causing this problem? Do you have any comments on that? Anybody could answer. I think you can just put up your hand and I will ask you to speak. So instead of me asking anybody.
Sir, in female patients, the predisposition to PCOS has been linked, sir. There are also adrenal hyperplasia and all those hormone-dependent disorders. There's a very strong linkage, and a lot of studies, sir, to manifest it. Patients who presented with galactorrhea, all these histories needs to be excluded because there's a very strong disposition. Sir, and also a lot of metabolic disorders in men was predisposed and linked, like the cardiovascular disorders, sir, with male pattern baldness, sir.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. We will come next part when you talk that. See, basically what they have found in recent times is that the retinoid receptors could be playing a role, but again, these are linked to the androgen effect only. So they are not non-androgenic in the true sense. There was a paper published by Sinclair about the erector pili involvement, and he has labeled them as primary follicle and secondary follicle and all these things. But the importance of this, I thought clinically, which may have an impact, is that if the erector pili has completely atrophied, the effect of medications is not going to work on these patients. Means technically, if I have to correlate in a clinical scenario, that if there is miniaturization is so far advanced, medications are not going to be working in these patients. Now, I would like to take a question from you. What is your opinion on the importance of scalp hygiene? Like Puneet mentioned that he's dealing with a lot of scalp, issues. So, scalp hygiene versus the pattern hair loss. Do you think there is any connection there?
There is a connection between definitely dandruff and seborrheic dermatitis and pattern hair loss, which is well established in papers as well, and it is also seen in clinical relevance that some amount of inflammation of your seborrheic dermatitis or dandruff can aggravate your telogen effluent, and also can also be present concurrently with your androgenetic alopecia. And vice versa, say if I have to put someone on minoxidil who already has a scalp issue, I'm going to aggravate the scalp issue and thereby reduce the compliance of minoxidil. So scalp hygiene becomes kind of very integral when you are dealing with a patient with hair loss, because any therapy has to be applied on the scalp. So unless you have basic scalp hygiene and your scalp is receptive, I would not, like say for example, begin minoxidil for a patient.
Would any of the other panelists like to add something to this? Yes, Sujit.
Yes, sir. So as Dr. Puneet was mentioning that there is a correlation established of the seborrheic dermatitis with the pattern hair loss. The other problem that happens is in the pattern hair loss, there are already less number of active follicles in the area. So the telogen shedding that can get aggravated because of seborrheic dermatitis, rest of the scalp, you may not notice the volume deficit as much, but the effect is more pronounced visibly in the affected pattern hair loss area. So apart from the direct linkage, even the telogen component that gets added further aggravates the decline in the volume.
My point of asking this question is that many patients will ask, how often should I shampoo my scalp? So the answer lies here. There is something known as the hair microbiome, which is extremely crucial. Now they have got a couple of presentations, publications which have linked to the microbes in the hair follicle in the middle and lower third, which have a pro-inflammatory kind of impact on the follicle, which may potentiate the effect of the androgens on the hair. Now, this is what they have actually found, that there are elevated levels of these microbes in the hair follicle, and this microinflammation does cause some changes. So just regular cleansing of the scalp will be a part of therapeutic benefit rather than, as an adjunct. So I always talk to the patients based on their lifestyle about the frequency of shampooing that they need to have. All of us know prostaglandins are linked to hair loss, and we will discuss more when we come to the therapy part of it. Do diet and lifestyle have an impact? Now, Dr. Gitanjali was mentioning something about this. So what would you say?
There's a direct linkage of cardiovascular disorders, overweight with androgenetic alopecia. So smoking, as we all know, causes miniaturization, and it's a well-documented fact, sir. So also we just spoke about erratic lifestyle, sir. The most important thing is the circadian rhythm, and the younger age group are now presenting with this, as you said, tying the mice to a cage, and the difference that was seen in the study. So I see a more of Amazon and Netflix happening late in the night, and you're missing these crucial hours in the morning, and there's no circadian rhythm left in the body. So there has been definitely a great increase in the telogen effluent in this group, not with the pattern hair loss. So also high fatty diet. So these are to start off with, and of course all of this leading to PCOS in females, and then the female pattern hair loss. So
it's very valid what you've said, Dr. Sujit or Puneet. Would you like to add to that?
So definitely, I think the main implicating factors is stress and smoking. One cannot over-exaggerate those. And in terms of nutrition, I think the core nutritional deficiency, which I at least seen amongst my category of patients, is protein deficiency. Because most of them are vegetarians and their diet is probably carb heavy, and they're missing out on the basic building block for hair, which is protein. And then again, obviously, vitamin B12, D3, iron, these are again the basic deficiencies because of the nutritional lifestyle that they've been following. So correcting all of these will definitely impact the hair. It will reduce the telogen effluent component, which is definitely seen in the earlier parts of androgenetic alopecia.
I agree with what you say. Now, when we look at nutrient stress on the hair follicle, nutrient stress can be caused by marginal micronutrient deficiencies as well as excess nutrition. The class of patients who present to us are usually in the second, because the second type, and it is not the fat as much, but it is the high diet high in refined carbohydrates, which is detrimental to this. Sleep deficit impacts the hair follicle in two ways: directly by impacting the the circadian rhythm, as she mentioned, but also by causing insulin resistance. Sleep deficit is directly linked to insulin resistance. So why these are important? Because these are the epigenetic factors which tweak the way your genes respond to androgens. So the epigenetic factors can make changes which could be methylation or acetylation, or changes in the genes, which will ultimately lead to a more potentiated. So one of the reasons why we are seeing younger patients presenting early with pattern, I'm getting 9th standard and 10th standard boys coming with grade 3 recessions, which is significant, I felt, and they are extremely troubled with it because their profile pictures are getting impacted. So this is a very crucial thing, and lifestyle modification has to be a part of the therapy, I feel, when you're managing hair loss patients. As I look at it, this is my way of approaching it. So these are the factors that are causing it. Whatever I do, I am not able to deal with the main causative factor. So I'm going to be dealing with an open-ended kind of management here, which is not going to cure the patient of his problem. So this is the first thing that I tell the patient, at the risk of losing him. But it is important that if you are able to counsel the patient in the beginning, it helps a long way in the treatment. So that comes to the point of consultation. Like when you consult a patient, with regards to pattern hair loss, means with regards to hair loss, let's say, what are the points that you would like to put across to the patient, in terms of having him comply with what you want him to do for practically the rest of his life or her life? Yeah, Geetanjali.
So once I've come to a diagnosis and I'm very clear this is going to be a lifelong affair, it's not a TE or a pattern hair loss classically. So I firstly try and counsel about the treatment bit. But after that, I have these 3-4 printed forms which I personally sit and counsel the patient, which includes everything, sir, which includes a number of sleeping hours. It includes diet tips, which includes, of course, the proteins, the veg source, as well as the non-veg source. Then it talks about your gymming and the proteins that you're having in the gym and their side effects and how to take care of them. It also includes the importance of iron, sources from iron, your folic acids, your vitamin D3 and the supplements that you need to have. Alcohol intake, number of sleeping hours, hair treatment not to be done, mistakes that you're doing while tying your for traction alopecia, etc. So all of this is typed and I give a printed handout and I counsel it myself, sir. All this before the patient.
Great. That's very nice. In terms of prognosticating the patient, telling him what is the prognosis, how do you all tackle that part? Because most patients, when they come to a doctor, they believe that they are going to be cured of the problem. So how do you deal with that part? Yeah.
So when the patient comes in for a consultation of pattern hair loss, the first thing I always do is I click the pictures of the scalp from the occipital and the affected area, and I show the patient the miniaturization that is happening. So the patient better understands what is the damage that is going on and how the number of follicles, if it's decreasing, how the progression happens and how it eventually leads to destruction of the follicle. So this is a progressive condition is what needs to be explained to the patient, and the prognosis now at what. So I tell the patient there is no way to predict at what speed and how much time it will progress to what grade. But yes, this condition is known to be progressive. So it does tend to worsen over time. So compliance to treatment, that's very important.
See, what happens is that when a patient comes to you with like frank baldness, you have already imagined him that this is the complaint. Many a time the patient will have a complaint that is a little different from what you have perceived it. So let the patient speak out, what is bothering him, because it is a problem solving exercise. We are not treating a medical condition. It is an aesthetic issue that the patient is facing, and I would rather have him come out. So this is the way I, have formulated the way I deal with the patients. And it is important to know that patient autonomy is always more important than medical paternalism. It's basically that doctor knows the best. You have to take a back seat here and let the patient tell you what he wants, and you give him the choice to decide whether he would want to do something, not do something. Because there are times when the parents have come with the son that they want him to get married, so they want him to undergo some kind of a treatment, and the son says, I'm very comfortable with the way I look. So I tell them that nothing needs to be done, because the concerned person does not have a problem, then you don't need to treat it. The same thing is when the wife comes with the husband. Husband is pretty blissful about his appearance. So why treat him? When he's not having a problem in his mind, then don't create a problem for him. That is the way I approach.
Absolutely, sir. Because the treatment is so long term. So we always, if it's not bothering the patient, it's better to leave it alone, because they'll be compliant for maybe a few months, but then it's not going to be a long term benefit.
And especially when you're looking at a surgical alternative, it is very important that the patient be motivated for it. Okay, now in your practice, like I said, how do you diagnose the pattern hair loss? What are the criteria that you use? Means in a way, like suppose you are like trying to, a patient has walked in and you want to say that, okay, this is my diagnosis. So how do you go about it?
So in advanced cases, it is clinical pattern thinning, which you can see, but generally you need more than 50% of thinning in a particular area for it to be very prominent to the naked eye examination. So in that case, the dermoscopy is of real benefit. And in telemedicine, that's the one thing that I was really missing is I couldn't evaluate my early cases of FPHL or early cases of male pattern hair loss without a dermoscope. So more than 20% vellus hair or anisotrichosis is the key factor that I would in today's OPD decide whether the cases of FPHL or of general telogen efflux.
Okay. Basically, I would like to ask the audience, do they routinely use trichoscope for every patient who consults for hair loss? Parikshit?
Yes, sir. Can
Can you
I
just,
put the polling? Yeah, I'll put the polling.
yeah, please, please.
So for the benefit of audience, I've launched the polling on this second
Yeah.
question. So you can vote. You have around 30 seconds to vote. Yeah. So I'm closing the polling
Yeah.
and I'll share the results now.
It's about percent do use the trichoscope. I feel it is a trichoscope is as valuable as a stethoscope is to a physician. Means it has taken me 14 years to get a grasp of what I'm seeing and how am I correlating it. It is not an easy job, and no amount of reading of the books will help you. It is only when you monitor your own patients that you'll realize what you have seen and what is the thing. So basically, when I look, yeah, tell me, Gitanjali.
Sir, I've been using my dermatoscope in the last 5 years of my total 13, 14 years of practice. Sir, the initial trichoscope was not that good, but now I'm using the latest updated version, and I think it completely changed the way I look at my hair patients now. The fibrosing way, or the alopecia areata that mimics your FPHL, or the frontal fibrosing. There's so many differences that you can just pick up with the 10 seconds of the dermatoscope. I think it's very important to have a trichoscope if you really are into higher hair practice. And I think we should not miss that looking at the poll.
Being a plastic surgeon, my knowledge about scalp pathology was limited to begin with. And you will not believe the amount of patients who come who can have coexisting problems which are actual pathologies of the scalp, having a hair issue. So it is important for us to have this to distinguish between the scarring, non-scarring, and even in the non-scarring, whether it is an areata or whether it is pattern hair loss. It is very important for us to have a very high index of suspicion, because it is very common to have a coexisting problem. And even a dermatopathologist with a biopsy is not able to give me answers many a times, because the decision to perform the surgery depends on the entire diagnosis. Now we have done patients who had a patch of areata and a standard grade 4 male pattern hair loss. Now the thing is that when we looked at the patients, that I've always had less hair in this patch right from the beginning. So we did a biopsy. The biopsy came out as equivocal, not sure whether it is areata or not. So then we have to take a special consent on the patient, that we have informed him that there could be a possibility of an areata being there, and that may impact the outcome, or it may even worsen the existing hair loss. Once the patient consents to that, then it is okay to go ahead with it. Yeah, Sujit, you were saying something?
No, sir.
Okay. So history is one thing that you will look at on both sides of the family, the maternal side and the paternal side. In examination, like you said, global examination is crucial to determine the pattern. And last is the trichoscopy, where you actually look at presence of anisotrichosis in the affected area and absence of it in the occipital area. So when I look at dealing with hair loss, these are the avenues that I choose to use when I'm managing them. Now, I would like to ask the audience again, how many of them are actually practicing hair transplantation? I think Dr. Raj has not yet joined.
No, sir.
Parikshit?
No, sir.
Is the connectivity issue?
Yes, I think it's a connectivity issue.
Okay, can you just put on this this poll question?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Audience question?
Yeah. So I have put on the poll question for the audience. So you have 30 seconds.
So the majority of them are not practicing hair transplantation. Okay. So now I would like to ask panelists, how do you decide on what treatment that you would, advise to the patient? What are the factors? Anybody can take the question and start. Yeah, Sujit.
So as Sujit, go on. Yeah.
So for a patient with grade 1 early stage where there is not visible scalp skin that is seen, so then I prefer to go for the DHT blocker only and not use minoxidil at this point. As a patient for whom the volume has decreased and they want to boost the volume more effectively, then in those patients I prefer using minoxidil as well. So these two are usually the core two things that my treatment usually encompasses.
So you start with a alpha reductase inhibitor right away.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And what would be, the basis? See, the way I look at a problem is that when you look at hair loss, pattern hair loss, there are two components that I see. One is a static component, that is the visible deficit that is there staring at you in the face, which is bothering the patient when he looks in the mirror. So the loss of facial framing is the key for my decision to transplant. But the dynamic component, which is the potential to get worse, is the part that will need a synergistic use of minoxidil and finasteride. This is how I, look at a patient. It's a problem-solving exercise. So if I have to deal with a problem, unless and until I combine the two, I will not have a solution for this patient for a long, in a long-term manner. So this is the patient who came to me at the age of 22, used to work on a ship and would keep taking the treatment and then dropping, taking and dropping. But you have seen him progress. This is the picture taken at the age of 28. And this is when I finally transplanted him. Because I generally avoid transplanting patients who are very young. So this is the way I look at, managing the patient. So preventing the progress, I will still need medications. Addressing the obvious baldness, I will need transplantation. Or if I want to camouflage the baldness, then I will have the camouflage with wigs or fibers or SMP, whatever. So this is the difference. Like, if a person has got thinning of this nature, a diffuse thinning, I would rather use medications and treat him. So this is just a response to a synergistic use of minoxidil and finasteride, while the other patient has lost his face framing. So I'm trying to get his framing and aesthetic proportions back in place. So it serves an aesthetic purpose. Now, this is the problem that you will know that a person is going to worsen with time. So you have to plan his surgery in such a way that you don't exhaust his donor reserves right at the beginning. So Dr. Sujit, now I think Dr. Puneet and Gitanjali are not performing hair transplant. So we will quickly go through this question. What are the factors in your mind when you decide about the candidacy for hair transplant?
So first, we obviously have to see how much correction do we need, like how much is the damage that has happened and how much area has to be corrected. Also the donor area, if it is supporting it, and seborrheic dermatitis or any other scalp skin issue which is there should be controlled. So these are some of the important factors that we look for.
One thing that I found is that the age of the patient is crucial in my deciding his eligibility for a transplant. Though patients can justify the need for a transplant even at a younger age, I feel that their emotional development is not good enough for them to comprehend the need for repeated procedures as well as long-term use of medication. So it is very crucial that the younger the patient, I'm a little more cautious. Obviously, like you mentioned, grade and pattern of hair loss. Yeah, Sujit.
Let's say for like a younger patient where you were a bit hesitant, but if the patient is counseled and with the medicine, if we can stop the further progression and the current damage that has been done, which we can restore surgically, then the case is manageable. It shouldn't be a problem if he's compliant with the medical aspect and prevents the progression.
That is the key point. If he is going to take the medications and tolerate it, then after evaluating him for 6 months or a year, then you go in for the surgery, because you will not know the response to the medications right away. And
True.
another thing is that patient expectations. Somebody with very unrealistic expectations are not good candidates. And like you mentioned, donor to recipient ratio, and obviously financial capability, because this is an important factor that you have to consider, because it is not a one-time thing that you will, deliver to the patient. So it is important that what you advise, you have to be careful about how appropriate it is, what is the feasibility, and is it safe with his context of future hair loss. Safety is not in terms of his, a threat to life, but more in terms of the donor recipient ratio. Now, these are the red flags that I feel that, whenever there I see a retrograde recession, then these are the patients I will not really want to go in for a surgical exercise, because they don't do well in the long term. Means having done my transplant almost 22 years, done transplants for almost 22 years, I've seen patients going through ups and downs over a period of time. And when I see the retrograde recession, this is something that I will not really attempt to do. And unrealistic expectations. Yeah, Sujit.
So for such case of retrograde recession, so I personally prefer putting the patient on DHT blocker, see his compliance, and there is some improvement that is seen in that area as well. And then at a later time, we consider the surgical option.
Yeah, but the implications for these patients are not the same as a person without the retrograde recession. So
yeah,
that has to be conveyed to the patient very clearly. Now this is the thing that we talked about. And I use this technique of, I've created a rubber stamp with the 1 centimeter mark, which I stamp out in 3 or 4 locations on the scalp, count the actual numbers and take an average of these. So we get an idea of what is the donor quantification. So coming to the question, like, how do you counsel the patients with the area of coverage? Because nowadays patients, having been bred on Google, ask you what is the density that you would implant with, what is the number of glands that you do. They are not bothered what they need, but they are going to ask you what are your credentials with these points. So how do you counsel these patients?
So now so what I tell them is, if you have, as an example, that if I give you a bucket of paint, you can choose to either paint one room or your whole house. So now the supply that we have is limited. Now the coverage, depending on how much is the damage, so that area has to be covered. Now whether can we cover it effectively with a good density or not depends on the recipient area, how much we need to cover. So the number of grafts, now we'll have to assess the donor area, see how supportive it is. We'll have the number of session will again depend on the number of grafts that we need to do. And the donor area harvest technique, now I only do FUE, so I don't perform FUT. And longevity of the transplanted hair, I specifically tell them that you would have to be compliant with the medical therapy. Otherwise, over time, after a few years, even the transplanted hair do undergo miniaturization over time.
Agree with what you say. The only thing here is that 2 things that are important to be conveyed. One is that we are not creating new hair. We are redistributing existing hair. So the quantum of coverage will not be the same as it was before hair loss. 2, when the area for coverage increases, the density decreases. So they are inversely related. So if I have to cover a larger area, my density will drop. So these are the few things that
Now the other thing is, normally without any miniaturization that has happened in an area, 1 centimeter square area, you would see somewhere around 100 to 120 follicular units. But when we do transplantation, we go around 35 to 45 is the number of units we implant in a 1 centimeter square size area. So as Dr. Puneet had mentioned initially, that when there's a 50% loss is when the scalping is easily distinctly visible. So that is why we need to make the patient understand that it will not be the kind of density you were born with. It would be a lesser density, because we also have to keep in mind overcrowding also interferes with the graft uptake. So there is a sweet spot or density that we have to give to get the optimal implant to regrowth ratio.
That is known as the cosmetic density that we try to achieve. Yes. And roughly, means I'm giving you my data over the last 2 decades that we have been marking these areas. The average density in Indian population of the patients that I have seen is between 75 to 85 follicular units per square centimeter in the occipital area. So if that is the optimal thing, then reaching somewhere halfway to that should give us a reasonable cover. That is how I explain this to the patient.
True.
This is something that is a more of a technicality, but roughly I would say between 4,000 and 6,000 is the number of grafts it can harvest, either using the two techniques together or a single technique by itself. But I do not believe in separating the two techniques. I would say these are two ways for me to achieve something. I can combine them sequentially or simultaneously. So there are various factors that are implicated, but since we are not getting into details of surgical thing, we will go into the other discussions. Now, one thing that I also tell patients, that patients who are insistent on only an FUE treatment, I tell them that if I'm going to do two procedures on you, I'm going to give you initially 2,000 scars and then add 2,000 scars to it, which is something that they should understand when I'm doing this. If I combine the strip and the FUE, I will reduce the quantum of scars. So I combine the two techniques but get an equal number of grafts. So that is how I counsel them. But at the end of the day, I leave it to them. If they say only FUE, we do only FUE. So basically, they want your recommendation. So you rationalize your recommendation. They are very much amenable. So a lot of patients who have come to me asking for FUE have gone ahead with a strip surgery because they understood the logic of what I was telling them. And we have combined a lot of patients with simultaneous use of strip and FUE without really depleting the donor area. This is something that I would really avoid, in trying to achieve the patient's goal of very high density in a very small area. Our outcome has to be to achieve only an aesthetic result. It is not going to be a real full thing, but it has made a difference to the patient's face. That is all that we are trying to achieve. So there are combinations that are possible. And do you do non-scalp harvest also, Dr. Sujit?
Yes, sir. Beard and chest.
Okay, very good. So when you're trying to achieve a large, area like a grade 6, then you will need to combine multiple areas of harvest to get the outcome that you want. So this is a patient almost grade 6 who was wearing a hairpiece, and we did 2 sessions for him. But here I have used only the scalp. So once we did a strip and once we did a full FUE. So we could get him the coverage that he wanted. Now this is something that this has bothered me. I have asked this question to a lot of hair transplant surgeons. And I would like to ask this to you. Is donor dominance really applicable to our hair transplants? I want an honest answer.
Like I said earlier, I tell the patient that medical therapy would be needed even to preserve the existing hair and the transplanted hair. Because I feel they do thin over time. Because after a few years, patients have done it elsewhere. Also, they do come and often tell me that the volume has decreased over time.
Actually, this is something that has, we have had these discussions amongst our hair transplant group also, that there are some patients, a small subset of patients who are not on medications, worsen within 4 to 5 years post the transplant. And these are the patients where, they are extremely reluctant. And there could be a feasibility of the recipient site influences. So I was listening to this lecture by Maxim Plikus, who actually says that there could be a communication between the surrounding recipient area, adipocytes, nerve endings, and other things, and the implanted hair follicles. So that communication may trigger the miniaturization again. So going on to the non-surgical part, I think now Dr. Gitanjali and Puneet can, really see. I have always believed that medical treatment in hair loss management is a matter of serendipity. Nothing is actually by design. It is all accidental. So these are the treatments that we know of. Okay, now I would like to know, basically, see, we know that minoxidil acts in various ways. There have been hypotheses for this. To date, we really don't know what exactly works where minoxidil is applied. But one thing is sure, minoxidil works if you are able to get the patient to comply. So this basically requires long-term application of minoxidil. How do you counsel patients and tackle non-compliance? Dr. Puneet?
I think we with them from the beginning is what works. They should know what they're getting into, and they should take it as their responsibility. so that they know that it is something that they need to do. And in the end, I asked them a question: if like a 1-minute application is helping you salvage your hair for so many years, don't you think it is worth that a minute that you take out of your day? So they need regular kind of hand holding, and you need to boost their confidence. And in the initial period when they're applying minoxidil, probably taking serial pictures also help, because the improvement is so gradual that sometimes they lose the whole encouragement because they don't see any improvement. So that's why taking pictures probably at the beginning, 3rd month, 6th month, and when they actually put pictures together, that's when they realize that, okay, that has made such a big difference and they should continue using it. So I think the patients have to take their own responsibility and encouraging them each time. So, each time they come to me, I talk to them about the compliance, even though they have been using it for 6 months, because a lot of people drop out of minoxidil once they have gotten some good results. So either in the beginning because of not seeing results, or once they have reached a stage where they're happier about their hair, these are the 2 phases where they really need to comply and push through it.
And Dr. Gitanjali?
So the one first important thing is that they might or they will have to use it almost their life. So that's one of the most important thing, because when a person feels it's just for 2 months or 3 months, these are the dropouts. The moment you know that you have to use it for lifelong, that's the commitment that you need. The second most important thing is the telogen hair loss that happens in the first few weeks, and a lot of them get scared and they don't even come back to you. And I think that's one important aspect that you really need to tell your patients that. The third most thing is, so you'll have to talk to them, but unlike a skin cycle, which is a 28 days, the hair cycle is usually a 2 to 3 month affair, or 90 days affair, wherein your initial growth will actually start in coming in only by the end of 3 to 4 months. So you'll have to be patient enough to wait to actually see the growth and not jump and visit somebody else or stop using. So all this plus the patch test, a lot of people drop out because of irritation, headaches, stickiness, cosmetological issues. So you'll have to keep telling them, if you don't like it, come back, we'll do it in the gel form. Chances of irritation, itching, the white cast because of the alcohol of the minoxidil, how you can take care of all this, hair styling, facial hair side effects.
Okay. Dr. Sujit, anything you would like to add to that?
Yes, so normally whenever I consult the patient for the first time and we have to start minoxidil, I tell them that this has to be long-term. This will be continued till you want hair. So how you brush your teeth daily, for the thousands of hair on the head, you will have to apply an ml of lotion daily. So if the patient sometimes look a bit hesitant, tell them to think over it. Maybe next time you can, if you have some questions, we can discuss it over and then start it. But it's better to start once you are also ready to commit to the treatment for proper duration.
I give them an example of a gymnasium, fitness workout. You go to the gym, you get fit, you bulk up, you stop gymming, you lose that, whatever fitness you have got. So these are something that we tell them. Now the compliance thing that is most common, especially with women, is the presence of the crystallized minoxidil on the hair shafts, which cosmetically, kind of takes away from the minoxidil treatment, and they have come to you for a cosmetic problem and you are creating an adjuvant cosmetic problem for them. So this is something that we need to deal with. And if you see a patient with minoxidil application and without minoxidil application, you'll be able to see the difference in the hair. So I advocate serums. What is it that you all do for these patients, and how do you time the serum application?
So the minoxidil serum application, or you're talking about the other serums?
With the minoxidil, a leave-on serum that I advise to the patients to take away that dull look that they have. So how do you time it? Because the biggest problem with minoxidil is that once you apply minoxidil, you cannot apply anything else on the scalp for the next 4 hours.
So no, usually in females, I either go for a gel, which is available, or I either go for a foam application. The white cast is much lesser in such patients, and 2% is what is advised. But then in such patients, I go for a 5% formulation. I, of course, see that the side effects are much less, especially when it comes out the cosmetic bit. But even then, there are patients who feel that there's a lot of precipitation happening. In such patients, I tell them, get up a little early in the morning. Let the minoxidil be in your scalp for around 2 to 3 hours, or at least for 4 hours is the minimum contact time. If you're at all going out, then either wash your hair, or you can use a little bit of leave-on serum that's commercially available, sir, to apply just on the strands of the hair and not on the scalp. So sometimes just application of a little coconut oil on the surface of the hair just for the cosmetic appearance also helps such patients.
Basically, when I tell them to apply the serum is applied on the comb. After minoxidil application, you just comb your hair with that serum loaded comb. It distributes the serum very well and it gives them the benefit that they want. And if they can use a light blow dry without the heat setting, it sets their hair very well. They get the volume that they want and they get the look that they want. So most patients have been amenable to this suggestion. Now, the biggest problem is that the success of minoxidil depends on the expression of sulfotransferase enzyme, which is variable amongst the population. The important thing is that even if we see the efficacy in 30 to 40% of the patients, we don't know whether the rest of them didn't respond because of the sulfotransferase activity or because they were non-compliant. So this is the biggest issue in deciding the minoxidil efficacy. Now, to counter the cosmetic effect, there is again an advocacy for oral minoxidil. So any of you, have you used oral minoxidil in your practice?
Very rarely.
So rarely, but I have
used it.
Yes, sir.
And how do you counsel the patients and what are the preoperative assessments that you do?
Sir, I have used it very rarely, sir, in few patients who reacted very badly to topical, who were not on antihypertensives, who were much younger, who had no history of any cardiac issue in the family. Or, sir, I started using it and then I read so much about oral minoxidil that I actually discontinued using it.
Yeah, that is why I have mentioned that it is not recommended, as the risk-benefit ratio is not justified. Because even the studies on topical minoxidil have reported changes in ECG. So oral is another ballgame altogether. Now, how many of you use finasteride orally for your patients?
I use.
All of you all use that as a regular therapy. I'm not going to get into the detail. I would just want the trickier part of this discussion. What is your take on finasteride therapy with respect to efficacy, sexual adverse issues, psychological adverse issues, fertility, and malignancy? So, Puneet, you can start.
So with efficacy, it's very effective. And if I had a free hand and if I didn't have the patient to decide, I would probably put all patterned hair loss patients either on finasteride or dutasteride. So I am sold on the efficacy. Sexual adverse effects, definitely age related and general lifestyle related. So if they're already chain smokers, if they're obese, if they have diabetic, hypertension, even in the younger population, I'm a little wary of starting finasteride. And most of them have heard about the side effects. So I have a very open heart discussion. I give them numbers. I tell them about the reversibility of the side effects and all of that, and then let them make a conscious choice. In practice, over the last 9 years, I've had probably 2 cases of genuine ED because of finasteride, which was reversed after discontinuing. Psychological, I think in consultation, the first time when you consult the patient, every person has an intrinsic psychological framework. And that's very clear when the person is communicating to you. So you would kind of know that, okay, this person is more amenable to the whole psychological side effect of finasteride. I encourage them to talk about it each time that they visit. And sometimes they have told me that I'm feeling general weakness because of finasteride. Then I obviously allay the apprehension that it's not general weakness, it's specific erectile dysfunction or decrease in ejaculate volume that one could expect from finasteride. Fertility and malignancy, I've had no issues. And for someone who is trying for a long period of time, I encourage them to do a sperm count before doing it. But again, it's like case to case. I probably asked 2 patients to do it because they were trying for like 3 years and the husband was never evaluated for a sperm count.
Anybody having any additional to put in? Yeah, Sujit.
So the patients who are on DHT blockers, so when they come to me and they report to me that they're experiencing some sexual adverse events, the first thing I ask them is, did you read about this and then you experience these problems, or did you experience it and then maybe you read about it? So 8 out of 10 patients I've seen that they read about it, and probably because of the nocebo phenomena, the presentation tends to be more common.
Okay, yeah, Gitanjali.
I had a question actually to add up. Sir, with regards to finasteride and of course the not approved dutasteride, I see these finasteride and dutasteride in the prescriptions. So informing about the side effect to the patient is the patient's right. So one dilemma, the moment you inform, as all the doctors said, they start feeling it more. So what I'm doing is I'm sharing a lot of guidelines to it, because if you don't inform them, they are going to read about it. So my dilemma is a lot of these patients come in the bracket of 25 to 28, 29 who are about to get married or who are married. So let's assume we don't do a sperm count in such patients, because the moment you get into sperm count or doing a PSA, etc., gets it a little more scarier to the patient, and there are a lot of dropouts. Is there a medical legal implication, and are we supposed to take a consent before we are starting with such a drug like a DHT blocker? How are we as doctors safe, or should that be a must in your practice when you're seeing so many hair patients, when you're doing a DHT blockers to all these patients? How crucial is it in this consent form? And
See, what you said has moral, ethical, and legal implications. The important thing is that we are dealing with a non-medical issue.
cosmetology.
So it is your duty to share every bit of information about what you're recommending and leave it to the patient to decide. The point is that how you share the information is extremely crucial. If you put across the information in a way that seems to the patient that yes, this is manageable. If you put it upon with focusing on the adverse issues, that is when the patient will just pick that part of the conversation and not anything else. The other thing is that I ask them to visit, instead of them Googling for it, I will tell them which site to visit. And you should always give them places where they can get authentic, unbiased information. Because the moment you put in finasteride, the first site that may come up is post-finasteride syndrome. That is the biggest problem that I see. The important thing why I asked about fertility is that there are been long-term retrospective studies, especially patients who are taking 5 milligram finasteride. When they were on the finasteride, they had done a semen analysis and they found that the sperm count and the sperm motility were in the normal range. And they did a similar study about 6 months after discontinuing. And they found that sperm count and motility both had increased. So that means that finasteride may be having some kind of an attenuating effect. And it is important that for people planning their families, it is important to counsel them about this, or rather defer use of finasteride till they complete their families. And it is important because the data is skewed, unless you dig for this data, you will never get it. You will find, going through geriatric journal articles and urology articles, that is when you'll find these things. They will not be published in the routine hair journals. So it is important for us to know. With regards to malignancy, there was a big hue and cry raised about the CA breast caused by, finasteride usage. Now the thing is that the implications are that if you look at it, it's a statistical artifact. It is not something that finasteride causes it. But if I'm using an off-label finasteride in a female patient, if she has history of breast malignancy in the family, I will not use it. And even if I'm using it, I will have a mammogram done before the treatment and then follow-up mammogram every 6 months or every year. So it is important that these things are kept in mind. If you are giving finasteride in a person above the age of 45, do a baseline PSA and repeat the PSA after 6 months. That 6-month PSA is the new baseline, and any fluctuation from that should be viewed suspiciously. So it is important that you counsel patients on these aspects, but tell them that there is nothing to worry about it. So, like Puneet said that he had only 2 patients. I just want to know, amongst the 3 of you, did anybody have a single patient of persistent adverse effects? Yeah, Sujit,
Not
Puneet,
yet.
No.
and Gitanji, nobody has had that. Okay, good. So these are the reasons that, and the biggest reason is the nocebo thing. But I feel that rather than them getting the information from another site or another source, it is best that you are the most correct person to give them that information. With regards to consent, I don't think consent is required, but giving them the information is most important. Prescribing anything to the patient without information is something that is crucial. So I will not get into this. Just that the other thing is that a lot of patients who have hair loss also have some level of depression. Some of them are on antidepressants. Now these patients are the gray zone, where you will use the finasteride or not, because finasteride is known to cause depression. This is a proven thing from the journal. A lot of articles in psychiatry, they have found that finasteride does cause a slight downing effect on the mind. So if a patient is on antidepressants, I will not use finasteride. So basically, it is important to ask about sexual history to the patient. If the patient is having an issue to begin with, again, that's a red flag about starting. Ask for psychiatric history. And it is important to inform him about the potential complications and then take a call about. Have you all used topical finasteride? Do you all use topical finasteride routinely?
Yes, sir.
All of you use?
Yes, sir.
And how do you counsel the patients for usage? What is the benefit of topical finasteride over oral finasteride?
It will help to give a boosted localized DHT blockage also.
Mm-hmm.
So I
The
think the
important
only
thing is
advantage
this. Yeah.
with topical finasteride is far lesser than the serum DHT and the scalp DHT reduction which happens with oral, but definitely the acceptance is higher. The finasteride formulas that we have in the market are 0.1%, and most of the studies that are available are for 0.25%.
Yeah.
It's much lesser than what has been proven to be effective. But at 0.25%, also the finasteride has shown systemic absorption. So even while applying a 0.25% of finasteride, there has been reduction in the serum DHT by up to 30%. So definitely some amount of finasteride is getting absorbed and thereby having some implication on the hair.
There is no dispute about finasteride being absorbed. It is like instead of taking a 1 milligram tablet, you're taking a 0.2 milligram tablet. What I tell the patient, I actually tell them that it is about 10 times less exposure. Systemic exposure is 10 times less. At the same time, the scalp is getting its full quota of the finasteride, and that is the logic in my mind to using topical finasteride. The only hitch is that if you read the package insert on the tablet form, that no pregnant woman should handle a broken tablet, you are applying there on the scalp. So that is one thing that you have to warn the patient, that no pregnant woman should come into contact with his scalp when this has been applied. And these are some of the patients only on topical finasteride. And topical finasteride and minoxidil. So this is the kind of change that I have seen in about 6 months' time. These two patients' pictures are almost 10 years apart. 10 years of using topical finasteride. Now this is another example where the patient was on minoxidil only for about 8 months and then switched to topical minoxidil finasteride. Now this is the change that I've seen in the patient over a period of time. Again, we have used it in some female patients as an off-label use. Now, I don't know about Dr. Gitanjali or Puneet because they don't do, but Sujit can tell us about using medications perioperatively. Yeah, Sujit? Sujit? I think there's some network. Can you all hear me?
He's frozen. He'll rejoin. So by the time he rejoins, I can add that when we do hair transplant in conjunction with a transplant surgeon, preparing the scalp with minoxidil and finasteride generally reduces the shock hair loss which happens later. Yeah. Plus the other advantage is the patient is already on the medical line of treatment, so he knows what is expected out of him even after the transplant to maintain that kind of improvement that you get. And if your patient is failing the medical line of therapy in the first 6 months before you do a transplant, then you also know that he is a poor candidate for transplant because he's not going to maintain the results thereafter.
Yes. That is that. This is a picture that I have shown that we have transplanted only the frontal and the mid scalp. The vertex has not been transplanted, but you see the result that patient has a more holistic. At the same time, I have been able to conserve his donor area without losing the donor. This is another patient of the same thing. I have transplanted only the front half, but the rest of it is the result is because of the minoxidil finasteride. So basically, use of topical finasteride has been as all these indications that I use it as in my practice. Now, Sujit we have just lost him, but do you all use dutasteride in your practice routinely?
I do.
You use it as a primary line of treatment or on failure of finasteride?
No, I wouldn't wait for failure of finasteride, but then younger individuals, I prefer sometimes to start with dutasteride because the results of dutasteride are far more superior than finasteride, and the side effect profile is also similar. And because of the tissue half-life of dutasteride being longer, it gives me the flexibility of giving a weekly dose or probably a thrice weekly dose, which for finasteride doesn't make sense because the T half is so small that when you're doing a twice weekly or a weekly dose, it's not helping them much.
Yeah. Basically, the only thing that I need to counsel the patient is that this will stay in the body for much longer. And it's a very potent inhibitor of type 1 and type 2. Now, the implications of type 1 inhibition are not clear to me because there is a lot of type 1 in the brain. So I really don't know what are the implications of that. And that is the only hesitancy that I have in using dutasteride as a primary treatment without having to see the results of an approved medication. If the patient does not respond or has kind of plateaued off, then probably if he wants more, I have opted to using dutasteride. The other thing is that do you all use spironolactone or cyproterone routinely in female patients?
In women with PCOS and who have multiple androgenic issues like probably acne, hirsutism, and FPHL at the same time, spironolactone is something which has been proved to be very safe, and I end up using it a lot. I start at 50 milligram and go up to 200 milligram if needed, but generally most patients will have a good response at 50 to 100 milligram. Obviously, I counsel about pregnancy, and if it is given with an oral contraceptive pill, it's the best thing when you're combining it with a CPA-based oral contraceptive. I have standalone CPA I have not used because the dosage is higher. And if a patient needs only standalone CPA, I am happy to refer them to an endocrinologist or a gynecologist.
Okay. Now, I would like to go on to the other treatments, what are very popular with the patients. And I would like to know, these are the way I look at these treatments. And I would like to know if you all are using PRP as a regular treatment for your patients. Do you all use PRP for hair loss?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
And Puneet, you also use it?
Yes.
Okay. See, we know that the proposed mechanism of action for PRP on hair follicles is because of the growth factors. And the overall outcome is reduced apoptosis and increased anagen duration. Almost 8 years ago, I was a part of a clinical trial that was done on the human platelet lysate. And unfortunately, I was not very impressed with the outcome. And I have tried to honestly assess the benefits. And we had a control arm where we used minoxidil finasteride. And if you see the difference between the baseline and follow-up of a 6-month study, the difference in the baseline and follow-up in the control arm is far more than that in the study arm. And moreover, I have not used PRP after that clinical trial, though I have used it to hold the grafts, in the process when they are out of the body before transferring them, but not dedicated as a hair loss therapy that I have used. So I generally ask everyone for an honest, Sujit is back online. Yeah, Sujit, we were just discussing about PRP. So Gitanjali and Puneet are regularly using PRP, and I guess you also, because you mentioned it in the chat that you are a proponent. So
Yes,
my question is that do you always use this in combination with the conventional therapy, or do you add this in specific patients? What is your indication for using PRP?
Now, it's more about the degree of severity. Where the severity is a bit more, in those patients, I advise them to go for it. Otherwise, if it's in the early stages of alopecia, then I tell them to just stick to the conventional medical therapy.
By advanced, you mean what? Means
Where the
grade
skin
of
is
hair
more
loss?
distinctly visible. Yes, sir, the degree of hair loss.
Okay. And what is the rationale that you, I'm asking this question to three of you. What is the rationale behind using PRP? Means in terms of, you know, the problem. We have defined the problem. So how do you, if you have to counsel the patient for, let's say, PRP treatment for the rest of his life, so how do you counsel him or her? Yeah, Sujit.
So I tell the patient that PRP, now there are studies that have shown that the fibroblast growth factor and the vascular endothelial growth factor, PDGF, these things in PRP do help with the component of androgenetic alopecia. Apart from that, the growth factor concentrate that we are giving to the roots as our treatment is going on. So I don't tell them that you have to continue with it lifetime, but I tell them for the initial phase of treatment where we have to reverse the damage, and for the initial part to help give the boosted additional benefit of this adjunctive therapy, we use it for the initial phase, and later we can decrease the frequency, or if the patient wants to discontinue, it may be discontinued also, but the core medical therapy is something that is much more important. If the patient ever asks me between a choice, that is the medical therapy more important or the PRP, I always say that the conventional medical treatment is more important.
So you don't use it as a sole therapy. It is always an adjunct to the
I have used it on rare occasions. Now, I had a patient who did not want the initial shedding that happens with minoxidil. He was very hesitant about using DHT blockers. So in a couple of patients, I have used PRP as a monotherapy also.
Okay, now there are a few questions that I would like to ask you. You mentioned about the growth factors that are there. Okay, now there have been a lot of publications, and I've quoted probably the best publications in the last 5 years. Now, what is important is that Philpott had done a study on in vitro hair follicle growth assessment in '94. And his conclusion was that adding serum, epithelial growth factor, and TGF-beta inhibited the growth of these follicles in vitro. And TGF-beta is a huge component of PRP. Okay, this is one thing that has always bothered me, that how I've asked this question to Dr. Tosti also, and she also has no answer to it, because she says that it is difficult to say whether TGF-beta has, see, TGF-beta is important in terms of a differentiation involved in the hair follicle scenario, but we are looking at treating something else. So putting in something that is already causing the problem, how does it, you know, how do you justify? The other thing that is important is that PRP has DKK1, which is again a pro-apoptotic factor. Now, this is something that, you know, the rationalization has to be there, and which I find it missing when it comes to PRP, because all the talk is that how many spins you need and how many platelets do you get. That is not answering the basic question of how do you rationalize this, because this is a publication from an orthopedic journal. They have quantified the cytokines. See, they are using cytokines. They want cytokines there. And we are on one point saying inflammation is one component of our problem, and we are putting cytokines there. So it is a little paradoxical that I find that these things are, you know, being implemented and being followed, but there is very poor rationalization of this. With due respect to all the publications, the point is that they are ultimately trying to solve the patient's problem. Yeah, Sujit.
So maybe the pro factors are outweighing the effect of these negative factors, and plus there are studies that do show the positive effect. So that is why, I mean, there would be some.
These are the questions that just bothered me, because, you know, I went through a lot of literature on PRP, because it was a dilemma that I am refusing patients the treatment. Whether I'm justified in refusing the treatment to the patient because I don't believe in it, or I have not been able to find a rational basis. But to just make sure that I'm not missing out something, I dug a lot of information, and basically the information published in orthopedic journals and dental journals is huge with the PRP usage. What you're seeing is just the tip of the iceberg where hair is concerned with PRP.
clinically, though,
the
when
thing is
we
that
do
it
use
can have a role as an adjunct. Yeah, Pujit, you were saying something?
clinically, though, when we use PRP, initially in the beginning, when we use, definitely it accelerates the results. And when someone has hit a plateau with minoxidil and oral medications, adding a PRP does help them reach a better plateau than what they are stuck at. So clinically, when I talk to most dermatologists and we discuss PRP in dermatology forums, most of us are pro PRP. The only issue with PRP is lack of standardization. So the way I may be doing it is different from the way someone else is doing it. And therefore, the results may be variable and there is no standard protocol each of us are following.
That still doesn't take away the fact that you're putting, let's say, instead of 100 growth factors, you're putting 80 as a concentration. You're still putting in growth factors. So it should never take away the benefit any which way I look at it. The dose will vary. The point is, when we look at PRP as a therapy, I'm trying to see how I can rationalize it in terms of what we know about the problem. Where does the PRP fit in? It should not be an empirical treatment that I advise to the patients. And you must understand, PRP has a huge placebo effect, huge. And patient mindset is a very important thing. See, when patient says, I'm feeling good, my hair fall has stopped, 90% of it is placebo. Because on actual evaluation, you'll see a very minor difference in the hair parameters. So this is a gentleman who is a doctor himself, has undergone 60 sessions of PRP in an academic institute, 1 session per month for 5 years. This is after 1 transplant and topical minoxidil finasteride. This is 8 months after the surgery. So the point I'm trying to make is that this effect is not entirely surgery. He has responded to minoxidil finasteride. Now, when people use it as an either or treatment, then it is not good. If you are using PRP with the conventional treatment, I can say it can be justified. But using it as a solo treatment, I feel the patient is being denied some genuine benefit in terms of treatment. See, this is another thing that was popular some time back. I don't know if it is as popular now, but it was an extremely pricey option. Has anybody used this? Any experience with this?
No, sir.
So the other thing is that, have you all used this machine, the Regenera thing? Have you all used it?
No, sir.
No, sir.
Again, here you're putting in like hardly some 10 stem cells and expecting it to have an importance. Now the importance here is that the benefit that is seen is that all stem cells have a microbiome surrounding it. And that has abundant growth factors. It is here that what you are seeing, instead of doing PRP or doing this, you will have some beneficial effect just like those seen in some patients of PRP.
But the Regenera is much more expensive compared to PRP.
I know, that is exactly. So there's a huge conflict of interest where these things are concerned. And they don't market it as a stem cell because ICMR guidelines are very clear on stem cell. Use of the word stem cell therapy in anything other than malignant conditions. So they market it as a micrografting technique. Any of you using these therapies, the adipose derived stromal fractions? These are basically, they use the lipoaspirate and inject it. About 10 years or 12 years ago, there were some studies which didn't show much because they had used it in cicatricial as well as in alopecia areata. But now probably there is more information coming. But again, the information is very sketchy on these parts. Do you believe that there will be ultimately a therapy which will be born out of stem cells or stem cell culture?
Hope so.
Now, what is your take on that?
Well, ages away, if at all, it would be a practical option.
Okay. The point is that the mice studies have been very impressive. That basically tells us that the trichogenic potential of the mice stem cells is much higher than the trichogenic potential of the human follicular cells. And having co-cultures of the dermal, the mesodermal and the ectodermal group, and to get them to form a new follicle is extremely difficult. So basically something that is still very much in the future. do you all use any of these products, bimatoprost, latanoprost, in your scalp hair practice, not in the eyelash? I think it's too expensive to use for the scalp. And what about the peptides? This is a. Do you all have any experience or your opinion on using the peptides that are so popular these days?
So I like using the Biocanin or the acetyl tripeptide, especially in. So I use it in telogen effluent as well, but also in patients who who are allergic to minoxidil.
Okay, but do you see any benefit out of it?
Sir, I do see benefits out of it.
Okay. What about you, Sujit or Puneet?
Minoxidil obviously preferred. This predominantly in patients sometimes when they have telogen compounding with pattern hair loss. So in those cases, I prefer it. Otherwise, even in the initial phase of treatment, I use it with minoxidil, hoping that it will curb or decrease the impact of the initial telogen shedding.
Monotherapy, I don't prefer using unless the patient is absolutely rigid about not using minoxidil right now. I'm buying few years by giving them a peptide. And then eventually each time they come, I will talk about minoxidil. So slowly and steadily, I'll gain their confidence on minoxidil. And my focus would be shift them from a peptide to a minoxidil eventually.
Okay. The point is that in my practice, I did do some studies on the peptides when they were launched about 7-8 years ago. But now, essentially, I use it as a placebo. Patient says that minoxidil I've used, I don't want to use it. I tell them, no, you'll combine this with the peptide, and they gradually wean off the peptide and then continue on the minoxidil. The idea is to get them to be compliant to minoxidil.
Sir, what I also found with the peptides was, of course, it gave you this placebo effect, but I also thought it conditioned the scalp, especially patients with very dry scalp who reacted initially with minoxidil became more receptive to minoxidil, at least to 2%, I realized after using it for 1 or 2 months.
That is definitely a possibility. See, now these saw palmetto extracts are not regularly available the way they were. So, because of the curb on the oral consumption of this, I don't know if they're available. Do you all have any source where you all get these products? I don't think they're available now.
As per the FDA. No, sir.
Yeah.
So the DCGI earlier was classifying it as a nutritional supplement. Now it's off-labeled it as a nutritional supplement, and it's yet not in the drug category. So it doesn't have any classification in the DCGI table. That's why it's out of the Indian market. International brands like GNC do have saw palmetto available.
Yeah, you'll get it on Amazon. Locally, on Amazon.
Yes, or you can call it from Amazon also.
So there is an interesting paper on Botox for the scalp. Do you all believe that it works?
No experience.
I feel at the end of the day, even when we are doing PRP, all of us are either injecting PRP with the help of an insulin needle, insulin syringe, or with the help of doing a lot of dermats do derma roller, which is nothing but creating a micro injury. Of course, the action of Botox is very different. There are also threads for managing hair loss, which we've been hearing it a lot in Korea, and the Middle East also is now getting into a lot of threads, sir. So I feel PRP ultimately then comes on to the micro injury and the micro inflammation and the fibroblast. That's how I think I strongly believe in PRP, because I feel the moment there have been utmost number of patients who've said the moment they have stopped PRP, the hair fall has been more in spite of being on a DHT blocker and minoxidil. And I ultimately put the micro injury, not the PRP, in these patients to be responsible for the additive effect.
So the next thing that I would like to ask you all is about do you all use this in your practice?
Sir, as an adjunct,
yes.
As an adjunct, yes, not as a sole therapy, because it's difficult to call I have the laser in my clinic, but it's difficult to call. There are a lot of housewives who don't mind coming 3 times in a week. But the other thing that I've now been trying to do is the time taken to make PRP, I make my patients sit in the laser room. But as per se, sir, just the laser light therapy, I don't have, I've not seen a lot of studies also, sir, and I don't have a sole experience with just laser therapy, neither the home health device.
Sujit, you were saying
I have some patients who are motivated to do it. So then I tell them to invest in a helmet at home and do it regularly, like 20 minutes, 3 times a week, rather than doing at the clinic.
Sujit, you were saying something?
Yes, so I don't do it routinely at my clinic, but for a few patients who either work overseas or they stay abroad. So when they ask what additional can be done, then I give this as an option that they can use it at home themselves. But I don't use it in my clinic on a routine basis.
Have any one of you gone through the FDA approval for the low light therapies?
The approval is mainly for safety, not for efficacy.
No. Apart from that, the studies have always been on type 1, 2, and 3 skins.
Yes.
Our patients are 3, 4, 5, and 6. So that is a crucial thing that I have found, that light is pigment dependent. We don't know the implications long term. So even the European guidelines have not recommended beyond 6 months of usage. And moreover, there is no data on colored skin. So this is something that I would want to mention to you. The other thing is that this wavelength of light is an extremely good light for wound healing. All post-transplant patients will come to my clinic for this. We don't charge them for this, but they will come and get this thing done once the scabs are out. For up to 4 months, I give them this. It is in the whatever benefit is there for the wound healing is definitely a proven thing. I don't know how we are placed for time, Parikshit. Are they online, Parikshit?
Hello. Yes, doctor.
Yeah. How are we placed for time?
Yes, sir. You can continue for another.
Just the last couple of things are there. We talked about microneedling, what Dr. Geetanjali said. Trauma to the skin definitely upregulates local growth factors. There is no dispute in that. But would you combine microneedling with application of minoxidil?
Sir, I do.
When you advise it to the patient.
So I do if I'm using an oil-based minoxidil or a gel-based minoxidil. Sir, I'm not using it just with the alcohol-based minoxidil.
Okay. The reason I ask this is that these are technical issues, but you need to read the fine print. FDA approval for minoxidil is application on intact skin. You cannot perforate the skin and then apply the minoxidil. So these are implications. So absorption of minoxidil cannot be predicted, though it is only a 0.5 millimeter perforation, but there is numerous perforations that you are creating in the skin. So it is no longer an intact skin for minoxidil application. And I think it is something that you need to keep in mind. You may have better absorption of minoxidil, but in an isolated patient, you may have issues also. This is something that I have no clue about, and I don't know if you all can, help me with this with regards to using the various concoctions that are available that the patients get in terms of stem cells from pineapples and apples and all sorts of things. Have you all used these? Any data on this? Because I could not come across any data, scientific data on these things. Sujit, you are in.
Completely moved to PRP based mesotherapy if I'm doing, but not using any external cocktails.
Okay. No, when I talked about mesotherapy, I meant only those concoctions that they were using,
No.
So this last thing, Sujit.
So earlier when you were talking about minoxidil and it has to be applied on intact skin. Now, if the patient uses the derma roller before minoxidil, they do not do it to the point of bleeding anyways. They do it gently just to create a bit of erythema. So there is no perforation that is created in the skin layer. So in that way, do you feel that using is not a problem at all, or would you still refrain from using roller?
Depth of derma?
0.5, sir.
What depth of derma roller do you use?
0.5,
so
sir.
Pardon me?
0.5.
But
sir, and I space it out. I do it in the morning, but the application of the minoxidil is in the night. There's absolutely no. Sorry, sir.
As I understand, you will not get upregulation of growth factors till you reach the upper dermis. Am I right on this? Because just stimulating the epidermis is not going to get you the growth factors. So you are reaching the dermis, and that is a good enough perforation. And it is a cumulative effect. It is not one perforation. One perforation is not a problem. It is a cumulative effect. And patients have no idea what is doing. So they keep, rubbing that thing onto their scalp. So that was my contention. That's all. Okay. How many of you all use nutritional supplements? And what do you use? What kind of therapy do you use?
So
Any specific? Yeah, tell me.
So I use the cyclical therapy. That's the latest trend. Sir, and there have been days when I have just used it solely, like as you said, sir, the people on the ship, and they've come back with good results. So the thing with the cyclical therapies, I'm really not sure, is it just the ferritin or the D3 or the calcium, or is it all the other cocktails that they've tried putting in? They have everything right from nettle extract to nettle sting to fenugreek seeds in them, which are almost all of them are DHT blockers. So maybe these are the mimickers in those cyclical therapy. But sir, I
will explain this when I have one slide specifically meant for what is going on, in terms of how information is conveyed. The point is, nutrition does impact hair. There is no dispute in that. Means I have no dispute whatsoever. It is, your follicle is a miniature organ with a very high metabolic requirement. It does need the nutrients. It is not on a priority level where the body is concerned. The body prioritizes other organs over this. So if there is a marginal deficiency, obviously it is taken care that the main organs don't get affected, but the hair gets impacted. That is how the deficiencies work on the hair. But what we see is that it is not only isolated nutrient deficiency that causes the problem. It is the nutrient deficiency of crucial elements with excess of calories that come in through a high glycemic diet. Today, also, if I evaluate all the possible studies which are scientifically, rational, the number of claims versus the control studies there's a huge discrepancy. And nutrient stress, like I mentioned, can work both ways. So it is important that you look at all aspects of the patient's lifestyle before doing it. And I do a baseline assessment of the iron status, the vitamin D, B12, protein, and then decide based on the patient's diet as to what should be supplemented. And how long do I supplement it? Is it for life? What is the benefit of doing it for life? The important thing is that I have talked to a lot of pharmaceutical companies when they come out with this biotin of 10 grams, 10 milligrams and all that. The important thing is that they have never respected RDA because they felt it is water soluble. But the impact of biotin is very crucial. When there was a case presented of a fatality caused because of biotin supplementation. The patient was on biotin supplements, had chest pain, went to the hospital, got a troponin TROP-T done. TROP-T was negative, so patient was sent off. ECG had no changes. The patient died later because it had masked the TROP-T. So it is important that we, even if we are giving nutritional supplements, if something is to have benefit, it will have a negative impact if it is not done in a proper manner. So the thing is that this is what I was telling you about. All doctors should be aware of this phenomenon known as zonerism. You'll Google it, you'll read about it. How the facts are presented to you is very important. I may jumble up a lot of things and tell you, and you'll end up believing it. And this is what is happening where the management of hair loss is concerned. I'm unable to come to a rational basis of what people are using as treatments. And hence, I feel that people should be aware of how gullible we are, in terms of the information being conveyed to us. I think, do we have time for the audience questions, Parikshit? Yeah? Yeah, tell me.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Proteins, what is the investigations you do, sir?
For the?
Proteins.
We do a serum protein and albumin globulin ratio. Okay. You also have to look at the creatinine levels.
Okay, sir.
Because a person with a very low protein diet will have very low creatinine levels also. You can correlate it that way also. Okay. And it's not only proteins. iron is the most crucial thing, and just a serum ferritin will not give you the answer.
Okay. So I have one more question. So before we just end this with the SMP, so you just spoke about a lot of patients who have AG and who are finasteride anyways have a low depression. So just wanted to understand the role of oral melatonin or topical melatonin in such patients, sir. The circadian rhythm.
The evidence on oral melatonin is very, very limited. But there have been 2 or 3 publications which have supported it, basically with the idea that melatonin impacts the anagen-telogen ratio. It does not have, it's just impacting the hair cycle, and supplementing it in patients. I would say if you're supplementing it, don't use it as a combination of everything.
So as an antidepressive or people with a bad circadian rhythm.
Mood elevator, but I'm not sure if the patient is having suspected depression, I would get him evaluated from a psychiatrist.
Right.
Because these are not something that I'm conversant with. So I will not know clinically what is to be looked for. But
Sir, I'm practically asking for these call center patients who come to us or these sailors who have these night shifts. So do you really think it will have some role in the circadian pattern, because they are anyways being
No, it will not have a role, because till you correct the circadian pattern, you cannot help it, because there are specific genes which work on this circadian rhythm, and these genes go for a toss, and that is how you have patients at 25 and 20 having hypertension and insulin resistance.
Okay.
In the same spectrum, you will have male pattern hair loss also.
Okay.
Do you all perform scalp micropigmentation? Sujit, I think, does this, no?
Yes, sir.
And Puneet, do you do it?
Yes.
So what patients do you suggest this treatment?
Generally, after medical line of management and they don't have good coverage of scalp, then that's when either a hair fiber or SMP is of importance. Most patients are happy using the hair fiber. The SMP is very good for people who want to use hair fiber, but because of the external nature of job, or they want to use in circumstances like say in a pool or during their gym, where because of sweat they can't, then SMP becomes really good for them. And also it's good for women because slight thinning in the frontal hairline, and generally they have to keep changing their hairstyles to cover and mask that crown area. So a little bit of SMP in those difficult to target areas generally improves the quality of life of the patient a lot.
Okay, Sujit?
Yes, sir. So I use it sometimes in combination with hair transplant also. So if the coverage, the area that we had to cover was more, so we space out the density a bit and we give a top up with SMP to camouflage it more effectively. Apart from that, compared to males and female patients, in females, I use it more commonly compared to males. In females, personally, I've seen that the response to medical therapy also is not as prominent as it is that we see in the male patients. So in females, it helps to use it as an adjunct along with the medical therapy.
How do you counsel patient in terms of, how many sessions are needed, and whether it is permanent or temporary, and whether there are long-term impacts of the SMP?
So when we do the procedure, I tell them it will be after we do the procedure for the first time, we will reevaluate after 3 to 4 weeks and then do a top-up session if needed at that time. After that, the pigment tends to stay in place for approximately 2 years. It does fade a bit over time and there can be a bit of a greenish hue in the pigment over time. But a top-up would be needed later. A re-session would be required to again give the dots the desired appearance to camouflage more effectively.
On a technical basis, when you say the pigment is temporary or permanent, the pigmentation is permanent or temporary?
I said semi-permanent.
Pardon me?
I said semi-permanent.
So it's about, according to you, 2 years.
Yeah. So it does stay, but it tends to fade and there is a bit of a greenish hue that develops. So approximately in 2 years time, 2.5 years, we go for a top-up session.
So if the patient is using alcohol-based minoxidil, it does not even stay beyond 8 months.
No, the thing is that you know how the pigment is metabolized. And that will depend upon where you have delivered the pigment. So essentially, the pigment is delivered just at the epidermodermal junction, just below that. The importance of this is that this is what makes it semi-permanent. And this depth will vary. Now, suppose if I were to put it in where the retipex come down, then the pigment will be in the epidermis, while on the just next to that, it will be in the dermis. So some part of the pigment will be washed out because of the epithelial cell turnover. Most of the pigment that is there, part of it is used up by the macrophages. But the important thing is that the pigment doesn't leave the body. It stays in your regional lymph nodes. And it is important to tell the patient the implications of this, because this is how you decide on the choice of pigment. So it is extremely important what is your pigment being used. And though there are no federal regulations on this, because the federal government does not regulate the pigments used for tattooing, but there are implications from health perspective. Suppose your pigments contain metal like iron oxide pigments. If the patient is to undergo an MRI, this pigment particles can get excited because of the magnetic resonance and cause inflammation in that area, or even cause artifacts. So this should be a part of the consent that you take. If you're using organic pigments without any metal thing, then it's a different issue altogether. But also it is important to do a test patch before you take the patient for a formal tattooing. These are some of the results that we have where we have used the tattooing for patients. Even in a person who is totally bald, or camouflaging the scars that the patient had. But what I've realized is that pigmentation works when you do the whole area rather than doing a patchwork, because at some point in time the distinction comes out, and especially in an evolving hair loss, you have to warn the patient if he loses more hair and stops coming in for the tattoo, there will be an area which will be pigmented. So these are the things that you need to counsel the patient about, but it definitely adds more density to a hair transplant if you do it about a year after the transplant. I generally ask the patient to use hair fibers first. If they're happy with it, then I tell them that this is a more kind of a lasting way to do the camouflage. Do you all recommend hair pieces to your patients? And when do you recommend this?
In grade 7, when the donor area is not going to be enough to give a expected coverage that the patient wants. So in those cases, or it will be best suited that they use a hair system instead.
And also for patients who have that kind of expectations, like even with lesser grades of alopecia, if the expectation is to have like a full head of hair and they're open to using a system, it can complement their treatment also.
Now, the way I use it is that if the patient's expectations and what I can achieve are hugely mismatched, then I tell them the best way to camouflage it. Like this gentleman wanted a dense cover, did not want to use any medications, but is thrilled with using a hairpiece. Another patient who came to me was already using a hairpiece with an intact hairline. I said, the impact that you have with this combination, no surgery will be able to give you this kind of coverage, especially the density and the coverage. So then it is better that they continue. But there are times when I have combined a hair transplant where the patient wants to conceal the joint at which the hairpiece meets the forehead. And it has always been helpful in these patients. So with this, I end my presentation, and I would like to ask Parikshit if there are any questions, and even you as panelists can extend the discussion. Yeah, Gitanjali.
So role of oil, do you believe in oil? The one which has nettle extract or all these DHT blockers, or absolutely no oil in your practice, not even the lauric acid based coconut oil?
See, the thing is that you must understand where is this oil reaching. With all the extracts in the oil, it does not penetrate the skin. No oil, at least from whatever data I have, is known to penetrate the stratum corneum and reach inside. So its effect on the follicle is not there. That is the first thing. Second thing, as far as the molecular size is concerned, coconut oil is the only oil that can penetrate the intercuticular scales and reach the outer cortex. By reaching there, it prevents the flux of moisture. Basically, if I use it as a pre-wash conditioner, whatever loss of moisture that is going to happen, it traps that moisture and gives a little bit of volume to the hair and gives a bit of conditioning. Other than this, I do not see any role for oils, because applying oil on the scalp is detrimental because you're going to block all the possible pores that are there. So it really doesn't make sense in my mind to apply oil on the scalp. The feel-good effect comes from the massage of the frontalis and occipitalis and temporalis muscles, which tend to relax after the massage. And it is, the oil has nothing